Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we're stepping into the ancient hills of Israel to follow the life of one of the Bible's most remarkable figures, King David. His story is not just about battles and crowns, it's about faith, failure, forgiveness, and the unfailing grace of God. David's story begins in a quiet village called Bethlehem, a place no one expected to produce a king. Out in the fields, a young shepherd named David watched over his father's sheep. He was the youngest of 8 sons, not particularly important, not particularly noticed. While his brothers handled serious work and duties, David spent his days guiding sheep, fighting off the occasional lion or bear, and playing his harp under the open sky. But God was watching. At that time, Israel already had a king, Saul. Saul was tall, strong, exactly what you'd expect from a king. But there was a problem. Saul's heart had turned away from God, so God sent the prophet Samuel to find a new king. Samuel was led to the house of Jesse, David's father. One by one, Jesse's sons stood before Samuel. The oldest, strong, confident. Surely this was the king. But God whispered, "Not this one." Son after son stood before him, and each time God said no. Finally, Samuel asked, "Are these all your sons?" "There's the youngest," Jesse said. "He's out with the sheep." When David walked in, young, sun-tanned, his eyes bright, God spoke clearly, "This is the one." Right there, in front of his family, Samuel anointed David with oil, and from that moment on, God's Spirit rested on him. It was an ordinary day that became extraordinary, because God doesn't choose like we do. He looks past appearances, straight to the heart. Life went on, but not for long. Israel found itself at war with the Philistines. Every day, a giant warrior stepped out onto the battlefield. Goliath, over 9 feet tall, his armor shining, his voice booming across the valley. "Send me a man to fight. If he beats me, we'll be your servants. But if I win, you'll be ours." 40 days, 40 nights. No one dared step forward. And then came David. He was only there to deliver bread to his brothers, but when he heard Goliath mocking God, something inside him rose up. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asked, incredulous. Word reached Saul's tent, and soon David stood before the king. He was still just a teenager, unarmed, untested in battle, but his confidence wasn't in himself. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine," David said. Saul, out of options, gave him permission, but offered his own armor. David tried it on, but the metal was too heavy, too unfamiliar. Instead, David took his shepherd's sling and 5 smooth stones. The scene was almost comical. A giant in full armor and a boy with a sling. Goliath roared with laughter. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" David wasn't afraid. "You come against me with sword and spear," he said, voice clear across the valley. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." The first stone flew from David's sling, cutting the air like lightning, and struck Goliath square in the forehead. The giant fell face first into the dust, the ground trembling beneath him. David ran forward, took Goliath's own sword, and cut off his head. Victory belonged to the Lord. Overnight, David became a hero. The people sang songs about him in the streets. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. But not everyone was singing. Saul's jealousy turned to rage. What began as admiration twisted into obsession. David was forced to flee. Even as a fugitive, men gathered around him, outcasts, warriors, the broken and the brave. In the wilderness, David's leadership grew. He became a man shaped by solitude, struggle, and dependence on God. There were moments when David had the perfect opportunity to kill Saul, to end the chase and claim the throne God promised him. But he didn't. "I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed," he said. David trusted God's timing, even when it made no sense. Years passed. Eventually, Saul and his sons died in battle, and Israel called for David to be king. The shepherd boy was now the shepherd king. David's reign was a golden age for Israel, the kingdom united, enemies subdued, Jerusalem established as the capital. David danced with joy before God, brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city, and led his people with humility and boldness. But David was far from perfect. One evening, when kings usually led their armies into battle, David stayed behind. From his rooftop, he saw a woman, Bathsheba, bathing in the courtyard below. Lust took root. David summoned her, and though she was another man's wife, he took her as his own. When Bathsheba became pregnant, David's sins spiraled into deceit and murder. Her husband, Uriah, a loyal soldier, was sent to the front lines to die. God sent the prophet Nathan with a story about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. David was furious. "That man deserves to die," David said. "You are that man," Nathan replied. David's heart shattered. "Create in me a clean heart, O God," he prayed. "Renew a right spirit within me." God forgave him, but the consequences lingered. Division and rebellion rose in his own family. Yet, even after failure, David kept turning back to God. He never hid his sin, never made excuses. And through all his victories and mistakes, David never forgot who the real king was. As an old man, David passed his crown to his son Solomon and reminded him, "Follow the Lord with all your heart." David's story didn't end there. God made a promise. From David's family would come a king whose reign would never end. And centuries later, in that same village of Bethlehem, a baby was born, Jesus, the son of David. David's story is our story, a story of faith and fear, courage and weakness, success and failure. But above all, it's a story of grace. Because if God could take a shepherd boy, a giant slayer, a fugitive, a king, and a sinner, and still call him a man after his own heart, then there's hope for every single one of us. No matter how far we fall, God's grace can always reach us. So remember David, not as a perfect king, but as a man who knew the depths of sin and the heights of grace, a man whose heart, through it all, kept reaching for God. And may we do the same.